The jungle air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something acrid that stung the back of his throat. Nathaniel Cade wiped the sweat from his brow, scanning the alien landscape for any sign of civilization, or at least something that wasn't actively trying to kill him. His ship had gone down 3 days ago, leaving him stranded with only the gear strapped to his body and a dwindling water supply. The distress beacon was transmitting, but he wasn't optimistic. This far into uncharted space, the odds of rescue were slim. He pushed forward, boots sinking into moss-covered ground, when a metallic glint caught his eye through the underbrush. He slowed, slipping behind a gnarled tree trunk, and focused. In the clearing ahead, a figure knelt, bound at the wrists with a thick metal collar fastened around their throat. A prisoner. Cade exhaled sharply, assessing the situation. The captive was humanoid. Female if the delicate bone structure and shape of her body were anything to go by. Her skin was a dusky violet, patterned with faint silver markings that pulsed like embers in dying light. Strange, almost insect-like creatures hovered around her, drawn to the scent of blood dripping from a gash along her arm. Her captors were nowhere in sight. Cade's instincts warred with reason. He had no idea who she was, why she was bound, or whether freeing her would cause more problems than it solved. But leaving her here, defenseless, injured, wasn't an option. He crept closer, careful to avoid snapping branches, and reached for his blade. The collar was thick, a smooth black alloy that hummed faintly with embedded technology. A lock mechanism sat at the front, partially obscured by her tangled white hair. She didn't react to his approach. "Hey," Cade murmured, kneeling before her. "You with me?" The alien's eyes fluttered open. They were a shade of luminous gold, wide and disoriented as they locked onto him. Her breath hitched, but she didn't flinch. "I'm getting this off you," he said, working the blade into the seam of the lock. It was an advanced design, likely biometric, but a skilled hand, and a bit of force, could bypass such things. She made a soft, choked sound, less a protest, more disbelief, but didn't resist. A few precise movements and the collar gave a sudden, mechanical click. The device hissed as it disengaged, falling away from her neck. For a moment neither of them moved. Then she inhaled sharply and scrambled back, hands pressing against her bare throat as if confirming the absence of the metal weight. Cade expected relief, gratitude, maybe even wariness. Instead she stared at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. Not fear. Not anger. Something deeper. "Impossible," she whispered. A rustling in the trees made him tense. He half-turned, blade ready, but no immediate threat emerged. When he looked back at her, her posture had changed. She was kneeling again, but this time it wasn't from exhaustion or restraint. It was deliberate. Formal. Her hands rested palm up on her thighs, head bowed. Cade frowned. "What are you?" A sudden hush fell over the jungle, thick and unnatural. Then from the shadows voices rose in alarm. "He has claimed her. The bond is sealed." More figures emerged, aliens of the same species, clad in ceremonial robes, their silver eyes flicking between Cade and the kneeling woman with something like reverence. Or horror. Cade's grip tightened on his blade. "All right, someone want to explain what's going on?" The woman lifted her head. Her golden gaze met his, unwavering now. There was no trace of uncertainty, only solemnity. "You have removed my collar," she said, voice steady despite the quiet tremor beneath it. "By the laws of my people, you are now my mate." The words hit like a physical blow. Cade blinked. "I'm sorry." "Why what?" A ripple of whispers spread through the gathered aliens. The one who seemed to be their leader, a tall figure with markings far more intricate than the others, stepped forward. "It is as she says," the elder intoned. "The collar marks an unclaimed one, bound by duty or circumstance. Only a mate may remove it, for only a mate may free them." Cade exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "Look, I didn't know your customs. I was just trying to help." "There is no undoing the act, off-worlder," the elder interrupted, voice calm but resolute. "The bond is law. It has been witnessed." Cade's pulse pounded in his ears. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. He turned back to the woman, his supposed mate. She was watching him closely, fingers curled against her palms, her entire body wound tight as if bracing for rejection. "Is this what you want?" he asked. Her lips parted, but no words came immediately. Then slowly she nodded. It does not matter what I want, she admitted, quiet but firm. The bond has been made. Her gaze held his, waiting. The weight of 100 watching eyes pressed down on him, suffocating. Cade had survived a crashed ship, alien beasts and an uncharted jungle. But somehow this moment felt far more dangerous. Cade had faced impossible odds before. Battles in the depths of space, firefights where the air was thick with smoke and blood, survival against creatures that saw humans as nothing more than soft meat wrapped in fragile armor. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for standing in the center of an alien village, surrounded by beings who spoke in hushed reverence about a marriage he hadn't agreed to, while the woman at the center of it all remained impossibly calm. She walked ahead of him, guiding him through winding stone pathways illuminated by glowing flora, the scent of something sweet and unfamiliar lingering in the humid air. Her movements were graceful, but there was a stiffness to her shoulders, a tension that suggested she was bracing for something unseen. Cade kept his voice low as he matched her pace. So, he began, if I understand this correctly, I passed your people's version of an impromptu wedding ceremony by breaking that collar. She nodded once. And there's no way to undo this? Another nod. Cade exhaled sharply through his nose. I don't suppose there's a way to contest it? Appeal to some kind of, I don't know, alien marriage court. For the first time since this mess started, her lips twitched slightly, as if the ghost of a smile had tried to form before she smothered it. No court would challenge the bond. To do so would be to deny the will of fate. Cade dragged a hand through his hair, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Great. Fantastic. So I'm married by accident to a woman I don't even know, on a planet where apparently fate trumps free will. She stopped walking, turning to face him with a piercing gaze. Do you regret it? The question wasn't what he expected. He had been ready for more ritual explanations, more alien customs he couldn't hope to navigate. Instead, she was watching him intently, golden eyes searching for something in his face that he wasn't sure he could give. Cade let the silence stretch between them before answering. I don't regret helping you. But I don't know what this means for either of us. I don't even know your name. She blinked as if realizing the oversight for the first time. My name is Silissa. He repeated it under his breath, letting the syllables settle on his tongue. It was softer than he expected, carrying a whisper of something ancient. All right, Silissa. What happens next? She hesitated, shifting slightly. Now, you must prove yourself. Cade narrowed his eyes. To who? She gestured ahead where a large stone structure loomed in the center of the village. The alien crowd had already begun to gather, murmuring in anticipation. Torches flickered, casting strange shadows on the worn carvings embedded in the structure's walls. The air felt charged, alive with expectation. To them. To my people. Celeste's voice was even, but there was something guarded in the way she spoke. You are my maiden name, but you must show that you are worthy of the title. Cade crossed his arms. And if I refuse? The silence that followed was answer enough. With a resigned sigh, he stepped forward. The gathered aliens parted to let him through, their expressions unreadable. A figure emerged from the crowd, taller than the rest, draped in ornate fabric that shimmered in the firelight. The elder from before, the one who had declared the bond as law. You stand before the watchers, the elder intoned, voice deep and measured. You have taken what was given. Now you must prove you can keep it. Cade barely suppressed an eye roll. And how exactly do I do that? The elder raised a hand, and from the crowd 2 warriors stepped forward, each holding something in their hands. One carried a bowl filled with a dark, thick liquid that smelled faintly of charred metal. The other held a long, curved blade, its surface etched with intricate runes. You will face 2 trials, the elder continued. One of endurance. One of strength. Cade eyed the bowl warily. Endurance first, I'm guessing? The elder inclined his head. Drink. Cade accepted the bowl, glancing at Silissa, but her expression remained unreadable. The liquid inside was almost black, moving sluggishly against the sides of the vessel. His gut told him this wasn't going to be pleasant. With a final breath, he tipped the bowl back and drank. The taste was indescribable, like fire and ice colliding in his veins, like swallowing the aftermath of a lightning strike. His muscles seized instantly, his vision momentarily dimming as his body fought to adjust. He barely heard the approving murmurs around him. The pain passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a strange, lingering warmth. Cade rolled his shoulders, testing his movements. That all you got? A ripple of amusement passed through the crowd, but the elder merely gestured toward the second warrior. The blade was placed in Cade's hands, its weight solid and real. You must now face a warrior, the elder said. Defeat them and the trials are complete. Cade tightened his grip, his gaze shifting to the one stepping forward to meet him. The alien warrior was massive, easily a head taller, with arms corded with muscle and eyes gleaming with anticipation. Of course, Cade muttered. Wouldn't be a proper ceremony without a fight. The warrior lunged, blade slicing through the air. Cade barely sidestepped in time, instincts kicking in as he twisted his own weapon to block. Sparks flew on impact. The force behind the strike sent a jolt up his arm. He adjusted quickly. His opponent was stronger, but strength wasn't everything. Cade had fought bigger, faster, more dangerous things. He needed to be smart. He feinted left, drawing the warrior's weight in that direction, then pivoted sharply, slamming the hilt of his blade into his opponent's side. The warrior grunted, staggering. Cade pressed the advantage, sweeping a leg out and knocking them off balance. The fight ended in seconds. The warrior hit the ground hard and Cade's blade was at their throat before they could recover. A hush fell over the crowd. Nature. The elder stepped forward, nodding in approval. It is done. Cade lowered the blade, exhaling slowly. He turned to Celessa, who met his gaze with something different in her expression now. Something closer to admiration. Well, he said, voice edged with dry humor. I suppose that means I'm officially stuck with you. Celessa's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile but close. It means, she corrected softly, that you are one of us now. Cade wasn't sure if that was better or worse. Cade hadn't expected marriage to come with so much ceremony, but as the night stretched on, the village continued to celebrate, their fires burning high into the thick, humid air. The tension from the trials had given way to a strange sense of acceptance, a shift in the way the villagers looked at him, not as an outsider but as something more. He didn't know if that was a good thing. Celessa remained by his side, silent but present. She moved with effortless grace through the crowd, nodding when spoken to, offering measured words when required. Yet, despite her composed exterior, Cade could sense the weight behind her eyes, the careful way she avoided looking at him for too long. When the celebrations began to slow, she finally turned to him. Come. He followed her through the winding paths of the village, up a series of stone steps carved into the mountainside. The fires below flickered in the distance, their glow growing faint as the jungle swallowed them. Higher and higher they climbed until they reached a plateau overlooking the land. A structure stood at its center, built of dark stone, its entrance framed by two massive, weathered pillars. This is where you'll stay, Celessa said, stepping inside. Cade hesitated before following, his gaze sweeping across the room. It was simple but well made. Woven tapestries adorned the walls. A bed of furs and blankets rested in one corner, and a low circular table sat in the center. A small, open window allowed the cool night air to slip through. He glanced at her. Is this your home? Pause. Then ours. The words settled heavily between them. Cade exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Celeste, I need to know. Do you actually want this? She stood near the table, hands resting lightly against its surface. It does not matter what I want. That's not an answer. She let out a slow breath before meeting his gaze. You do not understand what the collar meant. It was not simply a symbol of unbonded status. It was a binding contract. I was to be given to another. A decision made for me long ago. Cade's jaw tightened. Given. She nodded. To the first blade of the Arathane Dominion. He didn't know the name, but he didn't like the sound of it. I was a political offering, she continued, voice measured but firm. A means to secure an alliance. The collar ensured my compliance. But now. Cade didn't need her to finish. Now that alliance was broken. Now the first blade had been denied his prize. Cade scrubbed a hand down his face. So what happens when they come looking for you? They will not ask, Celessa said. They will take. The certainty in her voice made his stomach twist. He had spent his entire life getting into trouble, but this was something else entirely. He had unknowingly put himself in the path of an enemy he didn't even know existed. Cade stepped closer, watching her carefully. Do you regret it? She hesitated, then said, "No." That answer was enough. "All right," he murmured, rolling his shoulders. "Then if they come, we deal with it." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You speak as if it is so simple." Cade smirked. "I've never been good at complicated." For the first time that night, some of the tension left her shoulders. She studied him, as if seeing him differently now, as if weighing something she hadn't dared to before. Finally she said, "Then we stand together." Cade didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, standing in the quiet of their shared home, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, he wasn't backing down. The morning came with the distant echoes of drums, their rhythms steady and deliberate, rolling through the valley like the heartbeat of something ancient. Cade stood at the edge of the plateau, watching the mist shift over the dense jungle below. The village remained quiet, but he could feel it, an unspoken tension lingering in the air, pressing down like a storm on the horizon. Silessa moved beside him, silent as ever, her gaze fixed on the distant tree line. She didn't need to say anything. He already knew. "They're here, aren't they?" Cade muttered. She nodded. "Scouts first." Watching, measuring. "The Dominion does not move without certainty." Cade exhaled slowly, flexing his fingers. "How long until they decide watching isn't enough?" She turned to him then, golden eyes unwavering. "Not long." It wasn't fear in her expression. It was something colder, sharper. A quiet acceptance of what was coming. Cade recognized it because he had felt it himself, in battles where survival wasn't guaranteed, where the only way forward was through blood and fire. He glanced at the blade resting against the wall of their shared home. The same one he had used in the trial. "If they come for you, I need to know, will your people fight?" Pause. "Then they will not submit." That was enough. Cade rolled his shoulders, turning to face her fully. "Then we make sure they regret coming here." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Come." He followed her down the steps, back toward the heart of the village. The elders had already gathered, their expressions grim but resolute. The tallest among them, the same one who had presided over the trials, stepped forward. "The Dominion marches," the elder said, voice like stone. "They bring fire and steel." Cade tilted his head. "And?" The elder's gaze settled on him, searching. "And we will stand." A slow grin pulled at Cade's lips. "Good answer." He looked at Silessa, met her steady gaze, and felt something shift between them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about defiance. And Cade had always been good at that. The first sign of the Dominion's arrival was the unnatural silence. The jungle, once alive with the hum of unseen creatures, had gone still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Cade stood at the village's outer perimeter, his grip firm on the curved blade he had been given, his heartbeat steady but alert. He had been in enough battles to know when the enemy was close. Silessa stood beside him, her expression unreadable, but he could sense the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. This was more than an invasion. It was a reckoning, one she had spent her life knowing would come. "They expect surrender," she murmured, her golden eyes scanning the tree-line. Cade smirked, shifting his stance. "They're gonna be real disappointed." A low, warbling call echoed from the depths of the jungle, then another. Shadows shifted between the trees. Figures in dark armor, their movements precise, their weapons reflecting the dull glow of morning light. The Arathane Dominion was not known for subtlety. They wanted to be seen. The villagers had gathered behind Cade and Silessa, weapons of stone and metal clutched in steady hands. They were not an army, not trained soldiers, but they carried something stronger than steel: resolve. A single figure emerged from the trees, tall and imposing, clad in layered plates of silver-black armor. The first blade. Cade recognized the authority in his stance, the way the Dominion warriors behind him stood rigid, awaiting his command. This was a man accustomed to obedience. A man who did not expect defiance. The first blade's gaze flicked over the gathered villagers before settling on Silessa. He did not look at Cade. "Not yet. You were promised," the first blade said, his voice smooth, assured. "That promise will be honored." Silessa did not flinch. "I am no one's to claim." The first blade exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if speaking to a child who did not understand the rules of the world. "You know the cost of defiance." Cade took a step forward, finally drawing the first blade's attention. "You talk a lot for a guy who walked into someone else's home uninvited." The warriors behind the first blade shifted slightly, but he lifted a hand, stilling them. His gaze swept over Cade, assessing. You are the one who broke the bond. Cade tilted his head. Yeah, I have a bad habit of breaking things. The first blade's expression did not change, but something in his posture did. A barely perceptible shift, curiosity perhaps. Or amusement. Do you truly believe you can stand against the Dominion? Cade rolled his shoulders. I don't need to stand against the whole Dominion. Just you. A murmur passed through the gathered warriors. The first blade studied him for a moment longer before nodding. Then let us end this here. Cade felt Celeste's gaze on him, but he didn't look away from the first blade. This was how it had to be. No drawn-out battle, no unnecessary losses. Just him and the man who thought he could take whatever he wanted. The first blade drew his weapon. A long, slender blade that shimmered unnaturally as if the very air around it bent to its will. Cade didn't need to understand its construction to know it was deadly. He tightened his grip on his own blade. It wasn't about the weapon. It was about the fighter. The first blade moved first, fast and fluid, a silver blur cutting through the air. Cade barely sidestepped in time, feeling the edge of the attack whisper past his ribs. The Dominion warrior didn't hesitate, pressing forward with relentless precision. Cade blocked, parried, struck back, his movements rougher, less refined but just as effective. He wasn't a duelist. He was a survivor. The first blade was stronger but Cade was faster. He weaved through the attacks, letting instinct take over, waiting for the opening he needed. Then he saw it. A fraction of a second. A shift in weight. A blind spot. Cade moved. He ducked low, twisting his body as he brought his blade up in a sharp, brutal arc. The first blade reacted too late. The strike hit home, carving across the seams of his armor. A sharp intake of breath. Stagger. Blood hit the earth. Silence. Then the first blade collapsed to his knees. Cade stepped back, his breath steady, his grip firm. He could end it. One final strike. But he didn't. Instead he turned to the Dominion warriors. Take him. Leave. And don't come back. For a long moment no one moved. Then slowly the warriors stepped forward, lifting their fallen commander. No words were exchanged. No threats. Just the quiet acceptance of defeat. As the Dominion disappeared into the jungle, Cade finally allowed himself to exhale. Celeste stood beside him, watching the retreating figures with an expression he couldn't quite read. It's over, he said. She looked at him then, something unreadable in her golden eyes. For now. Cade huffed a tired laugh. I'll take it. He turned back toward the village where their people, his people, waited. They had won. For now. The weight of battle still clung to the village, though the fires had burned low and the air no longer carried the scent of blood. The people moved through the aftermath with quiet efficiency, tending to the wounded, repairing what had been damaged and speaking in hushed voices. Victory had been theirs, but the scars of it would remain. Cade sat at the edge of the plateau, overlooking the jungle where the Dominion had vanished hours before. He should have felt triumphant. Instead he felt the slow creep of exhaustion settling deep in his bones. He had spent his life fighting battles that weren't his, but this one had changed something. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He wasn't just a man passing through. Footsteps approached, light and deliberate. He didn't have to look to know who it was. Celeste settled beside him, her presence steady, her silence speaking more than words could. The wind pulled at her dark hair, lifting it like threads of shadow against the fading light. For a long time neither of them spoke. Finally she said, "You should rest." Cade let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Not sure I remember how." She turned to face him fully, studying him in that way she always did, like she was peeling back layers, searching for something unspoken. "You fought for us." He exhaled slowly. "I fought for you." Something flickered across her face, too brief to name, but he caught it. A shift. A hesitation. Then a quiet acceptance. She glanced back at the jungle, her expression unreadable. "They will return." Cade nodded. "Yeah. Probably." Silence stretched between them again, heavy but not uncomfortable. It carried an understanding neither of them had spoken aloud. Then she said, "You do not belong to my people, Cade." He turned to her, eyebrow raised. "That so?" She nodded, her golden eyes steady. "You belong to me." The words settled between them, not a claim but a truth. Cade smirked, leaning back on his hands. Guess I could live with that. For the first time since this all began, Celessa smiled. It was small, fleeting, but it was real. And Cade knew whatever came next, whatever storms the Dominion would bring, he wasn't facing them alone. Night had settled over the village, the jungle beyond cloaked in deep shadows, but Cade remained awake. The victory earlier that day had not settled in his bones the way it had for the others. They had won, yes, but victory had never been a permanent thing in his experience. It was always fleeting, always fragile. He stood near the center of the village, watching the glow of the fires cast long flickering shapes against the walls of their homes. The people had begun to relax, their whispered conversations carrying a tone of relief, even quiet joy. For them the battle was over. For Cade it felt like the beginning of something far larger. He sensed her presence before she spoke. Celessa moved with the grace of a shadow, her golden eyes catching the firelight as she approached. She carried a small cup in her hands, steam curling from its surface. You have not rested, she observed, offering him the drink. Cade accepted it, letting the warmth seep into his fingers before taking a slow sip. The taste was unfamiliar, herbal, rich, carrying a sharp bite that lingered at the back of his throat. He exhaled, the warmth spreading through him. Didn't think I needed a babysitter. She tilted her head slightly. And yet you do. Cade huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. You're not wrong. He looked back toward the jungle where the Dominion had disappeared. They'll come back, won't they? Celessa nodded, her expression unreadable. The Dominion does not forget. Nor do they forgive. He expected the answer, but hearing it aloud settled like iron in his chest. He had fought plenty of battles before, but this wasn't a mercenary job, not a fight he could walk away from. He had become something more than just an outsider here. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Celessa stepped closer, her voice softer now. You do not have to stay. Cade turned to her, studying her face in the firelight. Don't I? She didn't look away, but something in her posture shifted. Uncertainty, perhaps, or something unspoken. You owe us nothing. He set the cup aside, exhaling. That's not true. Maybe it was when I first got here. But not anymore. Celessa's gaze held his for a long moment, and something passed between them. An understanding, a choice neither of them had to voice. After a moment she nodded. Then we prepare. Cade smirked, rolling his shoulders. Yeah. Let's. The fire crackled beside them, the warmth cutting through the cool night air. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Dawn broke over the village in muted hues of gold and crimson, the jungle beyond still cloaked in lingering mist. Cade stood at the edge of the settlement, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the horizon. The air smelled of damp earth and burning wood, remnants of last night's fires still smoldering in the pits. Though the battle had passed, tension lingered beneath the surface like an ember refusing to die. Celessa approached from behind, her presence a familiar weight against the silence. She moved with quiet purpose, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, golden eyes unreadable as she followed his gaze to the distant tree line. They will send another, she said, her voice steady. A stronger force. Cade sighed through his nose, unsurprised. Figured as much. He glanced at her. How long do we have? A cycle. Perhaps less. Not enough time. Not for what they needed. He had seen the way the villagers fought, brave but untrained. Strong but lacking the discipline that would keep them alive when the next wave came. Celessa seemed to read his thoughts. You intend to change that? Cade smirked. Gonna try. She studied him, something unspoken in her gaze, before nodding. Then I will help. By mid-morning, the village had transformed into something more than a home. It had become a war camp. The people gathered in the open clearing, weapons in hand, listening as Cade walked them through formations, footwork, and the simple but brutal efficiency of surviving a real fight. He didn't bother with flowery speeches or long-winded explanations. The Dominion would not hesitate when they returned, so neither would he. Celessa moved among them, correcting stances, demonstrating strikes with fluid precision. Together they worked until sweat slicked the backs of their necks, until muscles ached and breath came ragged. But no one stopped. Cade watched them, something in his chest tightening. These people had no obligation to fight. The smart thing would have been to run, to scatter into the jungle and disappear before the Dominion came again. But they stayed. They fought. He understood that kind of defiance. It was the same fire that had burned in him for as long as he could remember. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, Cade called for a halt, wiping the sweat from his brow as he surveyed their progress. They weren't warriors yet, but they were no longer just villagers either. Silessa stood beside him, her breathing even, her gaze scanning their people. They will fight for their home. Cade nodded. Yeah. He glanced at her. And so will I. She didn't speak, but the small shift in her expression, the softening of her eyes, the almost imperceptible tension easing from her shoulders, told him she understood. The Dominion was coming. And this time they would be ready. The night air was thick with anticipation. The jungle beyond the village lay in silence, unnatural in its stillness, as if the very trees held their breath in expectation of the coming storm. Cade stood atop the wooden barricade, his hands resting lightly on the hilt of his blade, eyes scanning the darkness for the first sign of movement. They were coming. He could feel it. Behind him the village was quiet but not with fear. Fires burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls of huts, and the people stood ready. Their makeshift armor gleamed in the dim light, weapons gripped tight in calloused hands. They were not soldiers, not yet, but they had trained and they had learned. More importantly, they had something the Dominion never would. Something Cade knew from experience could tip the balance in any battle. They had something worth fighting for. Silessa moved through the ranks with the ease of someone who had long since accepted the weight of leadership. She stopped beside Cade, golden eyes reflecting the firelight as she studied the jungle beyond. They are late. Cade smirked, rolling his shoulders. Maybe they got lost. She didn't return his humor, but there was something in the way she stood beside him that told him she trusted him. Trusted his presence here, trusted that he wouldn't run. That more than anything mattered. The wind shifted, carrying a scent Cade knew all too well. Metal oil, something sharp and acrid beneath it. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his weapon. They're here. A rustle in the trees. The faintest glint of something unnatural in the darkness. Then a single sharp cry rang out from the treeline. The signal. The jungle exploded with movement. Figures clad in dark armor surged forward, their weapons catching the moonlight as they moved with practiced efficiency. The Dominion had come prepared this time, no longer underestimating the village as they had before. Cade jumped down from the barricade, landing in a crouch before rising to his full height. He turned to the gathered fighters, meeting as many eyes as he could. You know what to do. No grand speech. No last-minute reassurances. Just the simple truth. Silessa stepped forward, lifting her blade, her voice clear and steady. For our people. The village answered as one. The battle erupted in a flash of movement and steel. Cade moved through the chaos like a blade through water, every strike deliberate, every movement calculated. He had fought wars on distant worlds, had faced enemies far stronger, far deadlier than these. But this fight was different. Because this time he wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting for them. The Dominion had underestimated the village once. They would not live long enough to do so again. The air was thick with the scent of blood and smoke. The Dominion forces pressed forward in relentless waves, their dark armor glinting under the firelight as they clashed with the villagers. Cade moved through the battlefield with brutal precision, his blade a blur of steel and fury. Every strike was deliberate, every movement honed by years of survival in wars that had never been his own. He caught sight of Silessa in the fray, her form weaving between enemies with an effortless grace, her golden eyes burning with determination. She fought like a force of nature, swift, unyielding, every strike landing with lethal accuracy. The villagers followed her lead, their movements sharper, their formations holding stronger than before. They weren't the same desperate people from before. They were warriors now. But the Dominion was unrelenting. A hulking figure broke through the defensive line, armored in reinforced plating, its movements heavy but purposeful. Cade recognized the insignia on its chest. An elite enforcer. The kind that left nothing but ruin in their wake. Before he could react, the enforcer surged forward, swinging a massive energy blade in a wide arc. A villager was too slow to dodge. The strike sent him sprawling, motionless. Cade didn't hesitate. He lunged, bringing his blade up to meet the enforcer's next attack. Metal clashed against energy, sparks flying as the impact rattled through his bones. The enforcer was strong. But Cade was faster. He twisted, dodging the next strike by inches, then drove his knee into the enforcer's side. Barely staggered. He needed an opening, something to break through the armor. Then Celessa was there. She moved like a shadow, her twin blades flashing in the dim light. She struck low, slicing across the back of the enforcer's knee. It dropped just for a moment, but a moment was all Cade needed. He brought his sword down, driving it between the weak point in the armor at the base of the skull. The enforcer shuddered, then collapsed, motionless. Celessa met his gaze, breathing hard, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. Only certainty. More Dominion soldiers swarmed forward, undeterred by their fallen commander. The battle was far from over. But something had shifted. The villagers did not break. They did not falter. They fought. And as Cade turned to meet the next enemy, he realized something he hadn't before. This wasn't just their fight anymore. It was his too. The ground was slick with blood and churned earth, the clash of weapons ringing through the night. The Dominion forces kept coming, relentless in their assault, but the village warriors held the line. Cade's breath came in steady bursts, his muscles aching with exertion, but he pushed forward, cutting through the next wave of soldiers with practiced precision. A sudden pulse of energy shot through the battlefield. He barely had time to duck as a searing blue blast ripped past him, striking a villager just a few feet away. The woman crumpled without a sound. Cade's jaw tightened. They had brought plasma weapons now. The fight had just shifted into something far more dangerous. Celessa's voice cut through the chaos. Fall back. Regroup at the second barricade. The villagers moved swiftly, retreating in coordinated steps, drawing the Dominion into the choke points they had prepared. Cade followed, covering their retreat, cutting down an enemy that got too close. He felt the heat of another plasma blast as it scorched the air beside him, close enough to singe his skin. They reached the second line of defense, a reinforced barrier of sharpened stakes and heavy stone. The villagers took their positions, archers ready, fighters crouched low behind cover. Celessa stood at the center, her twin blades gleaming under the firelight, her expression unreadable. Cade moved to her side. They're adapting. She nodded. So must we. The Dominion forces gathered just beyond the barricade, assessing. They had expected an easy slaughter, not resistance. Not a people willing to fight for every inch of ground. A voice rose from their ranks, amplified through a communicator. Surrender now and your deaths will be swift. Cade snorted. Generous offer. Celessa didn't smile. She only lifted her blade, her voice carrying through the night. We do not surrender. The Dominion commander hesitated for only a second before giving the order. They charged. The first ranks crashed against the barricade, met with a hail of arrows and spears. The villagers fought with a ferocity born of desperation and purpose. Cade leaped into the fray, striking with brutal efficiency, every move calculated, every kill necessary. A Dominion soldier nearly broke through the line, raising a plasma rifle, until Celessa's blade found his throat. Their eyes met for a split second. No words were needed. The battle raged on. The night stretched long and unforgiving. But the village did not fall.